Hello everyone, this is Ponder on Weather. In this update, we're going to be talking about my overall June forecast, which includes severe weather, record heat, hurricanes, and even a possible derecho. Good morning everyone, this is your June the 1st update. So we're going to give you an overall snapshot over the next 30 days so you can kind of plan ahead and know what to expect. So let's take a look at the overall satellite picture this morning, and you can see this big blob that's merged out here in the Caribbean. That is the remnants of what was Hurricane Agatha that did make landfall in the eastern Pacific. As a strong category 2 105-mile-per-hour hurricane now that has lifted northeast and just trying to get its act together and reform on the Atlantic side as this continues to traversing northeast over the coming days. But you can take a look at all the convection in the midsection of the country. That is along a cold front where they're producing some pretty strong storms this morning into portions of Oklahoma, as well as Missouri, getting into Illinois. And this cold front will set the stage of that severe weather as these storms will push further south over the next 2 days. So let's take a look at some of the severe weather chances over the next 2 days for your June 1st and the 2nd. So yeah, it's going to be mainly right along this cold front. It's not really predominantly a tornado threat today, but some of these could be some larger hail producers and definitely some higher wind producers into portions of the Texas Panhandle, traversing along this cold front, more of a marginal threat as you extend for, Oklahoma, getting into Arkansas, all the way through portions of the mid-Atlantic. And some of these storms could be on some of those quarter-size hail variety as you get into Pennsylvania, but especially some of those higher wind gusts up here into Jersey as well as New York. But tomorrow, that severe threat just kind of subsides even further as this cold front will start to kind of wash itself out the further southeast it goes. So you could still be seeing some stronger storms, but we're not talking about big hail producers, anything like that, not even actually severe storms. But they could be on the gustier wind side as you extend off the East Coast into portions of the Carolinas, getting back into, say, DC, into Jersey as we get into your Thursday time frame. But beyond that, that cold front will actually kind of lift itself back northward on Friday, and you get what they call northwest flow. So we've got a series of disturbances that typically form storms east of the Rocky Mountains and try to traverse along this northwest flow. And that's what we find ourselves in, with more severe storms setting up shop into portions of the Texas Panhandle, getting into western Oklahoma and east of the Rockies, right here in western portions of Kansas. So those storms could be on the bumpy side as you get into the late afternoon, evening time frame. And then as they push southeast, they have to rely on outflow boundaries to keep them alive. If those outflow boundaries don't form, then you do not get the storms further south. And then as we get into Saturday, yes, we have another disturbance that'll be blowing up again east of the Rockies. We could be looking at more storms into portions of Nebraska as well as into Kansas, getting into Oklahoma. But you can see as they push further south, they have to rely on outflow boundaries, and they kind of wash themselves out as you go into your Saturday time frame. And then again on Sunday, as this cold front will continue to lift further and further north, that puts the storm threat further north. So it's pretty much out of play by then into Texas, but most of the storms are going to be highlighted over portions of Kansas as well as the Missouri. And the same thing on Monday. Not really a severe threat. I think a lot of the severe weather really kind of subsides as you get into your Monday, Tuesday, and really Wednesday of next week. So now let's take a look at that little disturbance down here into the Caribbean. We've been tracking this for like literally 2 weeks, right? We've been tracking this. We talked about this overall Central America gyra type atmosphere down here in the Caribbean. Typically those things take a while to come to fruition. It's exactly what we've been looking at for literally the last 2 weeks. And actually, this is the same storm that the GFS model was sending these fantasy hurricanes into the Gulf of Mexico, 2 weeks ago. And all the ensemble members at the same time were sending it basically over the eastern Pacific. And that's exactly what happened. We had an area of convection on the Atlantic side switch over onto the Pacific side. That actually formed Hurricane Agatha. And then now that remnants is pushing northeast again. So we find ourselves in the same situation that we were actually in 2 weeks ago with this little blob of convection down here in the Caribbean. Now things are a little bit more conducive for tropical storm development, and they actually give about an 80% chance of this reforming on the Atlantic side. And if it does, it will take the first name of the season, which is Alex, which will be Tropical Storm Alex, and it's basically right on schedule, right? This is June 1st. This is the start of hurricane season, and we've got an 80% chance. And there's actually two systems. There's this one's little surface low out here off a stalled frontal boundary, about a 10% chance. But this is the one that I think that's really going to get its act together over the next coming days. But you can see all the ensemble members fairly pretty much take it over the Yucatan, and this heads it into Florida by the time we get into, say, Saturday, Sunday time frame over Florida. And I think once it crosses Florida, I think then that will actually start to even intensify even further and actually may become a hurricane on the off the southeast coast, not really impacting the east coast, but we well offshore. But I do feel a lot of the guidance is starting to come together that we could be looking at a tropical storm possibly hitting Florida by the time we get into your Saturday time frame. Maybe a weak tropical storm, but if it does form, it will be Tropical Storm Alex. And right now, the National Hurricane Center's got an 80% probability of it actually happening and taking a named storm of the season. But main impacts from the system is just going to be your very heavy rain, especially into central and southern Florida as you get into your weekend time frame. But as we expand the view and head towards, say, June the 7th, as we get into the middle of next week, I do feel that tropical storm will continue to intensify. And the latest European guidance actually has it dropping down to a 984 millibar low pressure, and that is right on the cusp of a hurricane. So it's definitely not out of the question Alex could form into a tropical storm and then intensify into a hurricane, but remaining well offshore and not having any impacts to land as this continues to shift and move off further to the northeast. The impacts from Alex will be to the state of Florida with the heavy rain, but then just a low end, very, either a high end a tropical depression or a low end tropical storm. The main impacts are going to be your heavy rain. But yeah, you can definitely see where the precipitation anomalies are for the first week of June. And a lot of the impacts are going to be right here into the Caribbean, into the Cayman Islands, back into Cuba. You got plans in the Yucatan, Cozumel, Cancun, Playa del Carmen. It's going to be wet. It's going to be wet, folks, for the next couple of days. No question about it. And those precipitation anomalies really increase as you hit towards central Florida into southern Florida. But you can see all the precipitation pretty much remains well offshore into the open waters of the Atlantic. But here, you got these basically series of troughs that have just been relentless off the Pacific Northwest. I just feel that's just going to continue for the first week of June. But as these cold fronts will lift further north and these series of disturbances form east of the Rocky Mountains, that's where you put your higher precipitation anomalies in the middle of the country, and as well as you head towards parts of the Ohio Valley, extending into portions of the mid-Atlantic. And that's the same thing where you see the temperature anomalies with the ridge of high pressure continuing to kind of dominate further south into California, into the Four Corners regions, much of Texas, and along the southern plains into the southeast. But all the trough and then the cold fronts really don't make it that far south this time of year. So it'll put all the cooler anomalies further to the north, and then even more below anomalies further into Canada as we get, overall for the first week of June. But take a look at the La Nina, because man, this La Nina is just not going away anytime soon. I know you're probably tired of talking about it, but it's here, folks, and it's not going anywhere, unfortunately. In fact, we've got a 70% chance of it continuing all the way through the month of June. So what you've seen is what you're continuing to gonna get, because the La Nina is just not going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, it actually is going to hang around, and it continues to have a 50% chance of it continuing all the way through basically the heart of summer, August, September, October, all the way through the summer months, June, July, August, and even as you head towards winter, folks. I mean, early fall, late fall, early winter. He even has a 61% chance of this La Nina just continuing. And in fact, if it does actually continue all the way through the winter months, which is rare, it's only happened 3 times. It's only happened 3 times, and this is a three-peat La Nina. That's definitely looks more higher probability of it happening. So this La Nina is definitely not going anywhere anytime soon, at least for the next 6 months, easily, if not beyond that. So let's take a look at the overall Southern Oscillation Index. This is an index I kind of follow for the southern branch, because you have the southern jet stream well to the south, which has been pretty much non-existent. So how you would actually read this and interpret this, typically in a La Nina, it's going to be a +8. To qualify for a La Nina, and we've been well above that. The average has been 12 essentially in March, 20 in April, almost 18 in May. So this La Nina is locked and loaded and is not going anywhere. It's definitely nice to see a kind of a blip on the radar. This actually turning negative today on a daily basis. But overall, what this basically means is the southern jet stream is almost non-existent, because they don't really like colder waters, right? So this is full-fledged La Nina down here in the equatorial Pacific. You can see all the colder waters. I mean, storms just don't like cold waters, right? So this southern jet, as these systems come across, it's basically just non-existence. That's why you're finding all the drier conditions in California, into the desert Southwest, creeping into Texas. And I think that just intensifies as you get into later into June, especially get into the heart of summer with this ridge of high pressure just really kind of dominating. But you can see the warm blob out here further to the north, and that's the polar jet stream, which is typically more active in La Nina setups. And that's what we've been continuing to see, is just this relentless flow of precipitation coming off here into the Pacific Northwest, producing rain showers along the coast, and all the rain and instabilities further to the north. And I think that's just going to continue. You can see the temperature anomalies into the Gulf of Mexico. That's plenty of heat out here in the Gulf of Mexico. And notice where Alex could form and turn into a hurricane with this warm blob out here into the Atlantic. And that's one of the culprits, because these warmer conditions are going to be fueling that storm and intensifying it to a potential hurricane by the time we get into, say, that June 7th time frame. But now let's take a look at the JMA, which is your Japanese model out here, kind of give you an overall summary for the next 30 days. So what you're looking at here is this kind of deepening blue blob, right? This updates every Thursday. This was last Thursday, May the 25th. But you can see these deepening blues. That's basically upward rising motion air. So that's why we're finding ourselves with Agatha. We're finding ourselves with Alex. And then that continues to be amplified even in week 2. So where it continues to have that upward rising motion air into the Caribbean, traversing across Florida. So you see these deepening blues. The environment is highly conducive for tropical storm development down here, or at least upward rising motion air of higher precipitation anomalies. But once you get into, say, the middle of the month, right? So I think it remains active for the first half of the month as far as precipitation goes, but we definitely see a little bit more sinking air. That's an indicative of some of these yellows and these oranges starting to creep in on the Atlantic side. You can see where it's not going to be existent is down here in the Pacific with all those colder waters. You got a lot of sinking air down here in the Pacific. So I don't expect to see any storms, as they push further off into the open waters of the Pacific. And these would just pretty much be ripped apart if they even try to head that way. The only reason why Agatha kind of held tight, because it was along the coast, and they still had some warmer waters along the coast. But we definitely see it's not as conducive as you get into the second half of June for tropical storm development, or at least the more higher precipitation anomalies into the Caribbean. So let's take a look at the overall vertical velocity index, because this fairly matches what the JMA is saying right now on the latest EPS guidance on the control run. So why I always take a look at this is you got to have like some sort of upward rising motion air to have any hint of any tropical storm development. And here's where we live down here, right? As you can see the map, all this upward rising motion air, that's indicative of the blue shaded areas, right? So between now and the first half of June, we've got a lot of upward rising motion air, kind of where we are into the Caribbean, or where we start to look for even tropical storm development down there. But yes, once you get towards the second half of June, and especially deeper into June, you see a lot of sinking air coming back into play. And that's also indicative of what the JMA is saying too. So you've got the JMA as well as the EPS guidance on board saying, hey, the first half of the month could be fairly active, but the second half of the month could be more on the sinking air side and less congruent for possible tropical storm development. But once we get into, say, the next week, right, the late next week, let's look at the jet stream, right? So this is kind of give you an overall map of what it could look like around June the 12th timeframe. That's a 591 ridge of high pressure. That's a dominating ridge, right? So I showed you the Southern Oscillation Index, the La Nina's back in full force, and it's going to be locked and loaded over portions of California, getting into the desert Southwest, all the way into Texas, with this ridge of high pressure really starting to be locked over those parts of the region as the jet stream lifts further and further north, right? It lifts further and further north as we see traversing off that more active polar jet coming across the Northwest, sending those pulses of energy and a little bit more unsettled weather, as the much cooler conditions and more unsettled weather is well further to the north. And I think a lot of the severe weather creeps further north as well, and puts much of Texas and much of the southern plains at a play as we get towards the middle of June, and puts more of the severe weather over the north central US and upper Midwest parts of the country, and eventually heading towards possibly into the Ohio Valley. So, and we can take a look at the overall 500 height anomalies and the wind speeds and kind of show you that, right? So the jet stream's well to the north. Underneath it, you got that ridge of high pressure. So that would put more of the instability by the time we get into, say, June the 12th timeframe over Nebraska, over the Dakotas, over Iowa, over Minnesota, where some of those storms could be pretty bumpy by then and increasing that severe weather threat. So let's take a look at the overall precipitation anomalies and overall snapshot over the first half of June, right? So you got all the above average precipitation playing off a hurricane or potentially tropical storm, potentially Hurricane Alex by then, with these well above average precipitation anomalies. You got the ridge of high pressure dominating over much of the west, of the southwest, and much of Texas and much of the southeast, as these cold fronts really don't make it that far south as we get towards the middle of the month. So most of the precipitation is east of the Rockies, more into Oklahoma, but all the kind of the bullseye over Kansas, over Missouri, and especially as you head to Iowa, through the Ohio Valley, getting into the mid-Atlantic state with those above average temperature anomalies. And of course, you have that relentless flow off the Northwest, pulling in all that moisture and then just wringing it out over the interior regions, over Washington and Oregon and parts of Northern California. And the temperature anomalies apply that too, with the ridge of high pressure pulling in. You've got well above average temperature anomalies dominating much of the south, much of the west, much of the southwest, much of the southern plains, much of the southeast, right? Jet stream less further north. You've got cooler anomalies off the flow here with the more active polar jet, and pulling those where you see the rain and more unsettled weather. That's where you're probably going to be seeing the below average temperature anomalies too. So that lifts well to the north, through the upper Midwest, through the Great Lakes, and through the Ohio Valley, as well as into the Northeast. So now let's take a look, say, beyond Father's Day. So this is what things get kind of somewhat interesting as you head towards that way. And of course, we're getting kind of fairly out there by now. But we're seeing a lot of longer range guidance starting to show this coming together, with that ridge of high pressure pulling all that heat out ahead of it. We've got a fairly significant trough. going to be diving in off the Pacific Northwest, right? And this is going to be clashing with all this ridge of high pressure that's going to be well above average temperatures for a pretty long time before I had ahead of it. And with this trough that's coming in off the west, we're going to be starting to see this kind of clash in temperatures as we get through the middle of the country. And by the time we get into, say, maybe the 24th time frame, I'm thinking that week after Father's Day is going to be fairly active as far as the severe weather front, especially as you head central plains and the upper Midwest states. Those areas could be under the gun as the ring of high pressure just dominates further south out ahead of it, and this squall line could form. So a derecho type setup is definitely not out of the question in a setup like this, but this won't be until, you know, after Father's Day. So this is definitely something I'm keeping an eye on. Obviously, you can't guarantee anything like that. It's a long ways out, but I always like to look at little patterns and little hints of what may be to come, so you can kind of, hey, well, you know, that week after Father's Day, we gotta maybe pay high attention, alert to the weather department, as we could be looking at more severe storms and pretty bumpy as we get into that after Father's Day week. So now let's take a look at the overall setup for your precipitation anomalies during that time frame. You can see the ridge of high pressure underneath, right? You've got all the above average temperature anomalies right where the trough is, right? By then, through the upper Midwest, through the Ohio Valley, through the mid-Atlantic states. And then once you get to the last week of June, kind of the same deal. Ridge of high pressure dominating much of the south, jet stream list further north. You got all those below average temperature anomalies and just average anomalies for further north by then. But the overall setup for the overall 30 days, for the next 30 days, you can see a lot of the precipitation with those upward rising motion air, especially for that first half of June. Puts a lot of the above average precipitation over where it's at now, where Alex could be, over the Yucatan, over the Caymans, over Cuba, much of Florida here, with those below average anomalies overall for much of the deep south and into the southeast. And the same thing, where you expect, again, higher than above average precipitation, you would expect below average temperature anomalies for much of the Caribbean of what you would typically see, you know, this time of year, right? So now let's take a look at the North American view of the precipitation anomalies for the next 30 days, right? You see all the active weather. You got the southern jet, non-existent, with the ridge of high pressure pretty much dominating much of the west, much of the south, bringing all those drier conditions. The polar jet lifts further north, more active. The more active conditions continue with the jet stream coming across, and you got the more unsettled weather more into Oklahoma, getting into Kansas, getting into Missouri, but especially as you head towards Iowa, getting through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and into Michigan through the mid-Atlantic states. And then the overall temperature anomalies kind of play off the same thing, right? Ridge of high pressure, southern oscillations high, southern jet stream is pretty much non-existent. So you got those well above average temperatures. Texas, I just think it takes a beating. Your average high is well into the 90s this time of year, and this is well above average. So you're probably looking at strings of 100-degree heat, especially as you get towards the second half of June, especially into Texas, where I think the ridge is going to be just dominating those areas with well above average and plenty of record heat on the table, with much of the cooler conditions well to the north, where the more unsettled weather will be. So hey, I know it was a lot to cover, so I appreciate you hanging with me. Do like this video, definitely leave your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to catch the latest update where I protect you before and after the storm.